Paragraph 9 of the exclusive right to represent seller agreement has some significant revisions to it. So I'm going to get started on paragraph number 9. We've renamed it, for starters, from additional provisions to seller disclosures, because that's what we're talking about here is several seller disclosures. The first one being the one that's always been in the listing contract, material information disclosure. And we know that this paragraph talks about our obligation to disclose those material adverse facts pertaining to the physical condition of the property, which are actually known by us. And we put the seller on notice in paragraph 9A that we must disclose these things, and it is up to us, our sole discretion as to what we disclose. Paragraph 9B talks about the residential property disclosure that we've always had in the listing contract, so I don't need to spend much time on paragraph 9B other than to show you that this representation beyond the four corners of the property has been deleted, and mainly because we felt like that why did we single out this particular provision that the seller is not required to make amongst several other provisions that the seller is not required to disclose under the Residential Property Disclosure Act. So we got rid of, for the sake of efficiency, that one disclosure outside the four corners of the property. Paragraph 9C, fair housing, was just revised to do what we've been talking about here previously, make a will from a shall, but also better align the provision 9C with what is currently protected classes in both the state and national fair housing statutes, and also better align with the Realtor Code of Ethics. Okay, paragraph 9D is one of the most significant changes that we're making to the listing contract and the purchase agreement as well. So we'll talk more about that when we talk about the changes to the purchase agreement. The General Assembly, in its most recent session, upon prompting from the Virginia Association of Realtors, was convinced that we had two separate statutes, two separate obligations in terms of providing disclosures, a disclosure packet and a resale certificate, and it got to be a bit confusing. So what the General Assembly did was sort of do a mashup of some of the provisions for under both of those statutes, and you'll see here in a minute what I'm talking about, and change the disclosure requirements from individual packets and resale certificates to just one document or aggregation of documents called a resale certificate, and you'll see what that means here. So, for starters, either you're going to talk to the seller and determine whether the property is or is not subject to the property owner's a common interest community resale certificate disclosure, but let's say for a second here that it is subject to. The properties, instead of calling it a property owners association or a condominium association, we're going to refer to it, as the statute has, to common interest communities, or CIC. And so what we'll do here is take the seller's representation, whether the property is subject to a CIC, and which one is it? Is it the Property Owners Association, or is it a condominium? And the reason we kept both of those in here was to make sure that we understood that these are really two different types of ownership and what the bundle of rights are by the seller and the property owner pursuant to each one of those statutes. We also included this, whether the property is exempted under the CIC statute. And you may be wondering, as did we on standard forms, well, what are those exemptions? If you look here on the revised statute, and this is where it talks about the exemptions. You can see up here that this code section is exemptions, and you'll see what those exemptions are right here. And we're going to provide this as a white paper or a document for your reference, but the exemptions are very limited to these things. Initial disposition by the declarant, disposition unit by gift, by court order, or foreclosure deed in lieu of foreclosure, and so on and so forth. So you can see here what some of those exemptions are. Now, is the seller going to know whether they're exempted or not? Probably not. So when you're going over this provision with the seller, you might have handy a list of these exemptions. As unlikely as it may be, it could be applicable. So going back to the listing contract, we're talking about here, and let's talk about assuming that it is not subject to any exemptions, that it would be subject to the Property Owners Association Act. Then the provision goes on to talk about what those obligations are relative to providing a resale certificate. So instead of calling it a disclosure packet or a resale certificate as the Condominium Act required, we're calling all the aggregation, the documents, a resale certificate. And so everything else really remains the same in terms of if the property is within a CIC, a common interest community, then the seller will obtain from the association those list of that resale certificate and provide it to the purchaser. The currency of it and all of the obligations that the seller has did not change. But what happens is that once the purchaser receives the resale certificate, they'll have up to 3 days. They'll have within 3 days or up to 7 days, if extended by the ratified real estate contract. When we get over to talking about the purchase agreement, we'll see where we will continue to be able to negotiate that time period. And speaking of the ability to negotiate those time frames between 3 and 7 days, let me point out to you a couple of fairly significant provisions that existed in the Property Owners Association Act and the Condominium Act that, quite frankly, was an oversight that didn't make it to this statute. So those provisions have to do with the purchaser's ability to waive their rights under the Act, this new Resale Disclosure Act, the purchaser's ability to waive their rights under the Act in terms of the review of the resale certificate and the cancellation period, and either party's ability to vary from the provisions in the statute. Let me show you what that looked like before. In the Property Owners Association Act, under Code Section 55-1-1808, it talked about in paragraph number G that the provisions of this section and the provisions of 1809, which was that laundry list of things that were to be included in then called, or currently called, the packet, if you will. But anyway, those provisions may not be varied by agreement, and the rights conferred by this section may not be waived. This provision did not make it to the new, it was an oversight, but did not make it to the new statute. Additionally, in the Condominium Act, in Code Section 55-1-1902, variation by agreement, except as expressly provided in this chapter, the provisions of this chapter shall not be varied by agreement, and the rights conferred by this chapter shall not be waived. So what that means is, and again, both of these as an oversight, but it might end up being an okay oversight, did not make it to the new Resale Disclosure Act. And what that means is the seller still has to provide the resale certificate. That language is elsewhere in the statute, that the seller shall provide. So that part cannot be waived. What can be waived is the purchaser's the time frame for cancellation, and either party can negotiate and vary from the statute between 3 and 7. So for example, a purchaser could, and once we get to the purchase agreement, you'll see put 0 in that field, for example. Or I suppose they could put 10 in that field. In other words, they can vary outside the 3 to 7 days, not business days, 3 to 7 days. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to see your broker or have your broker contact me or Laura Benjamin at the association office, and we'll be happy to answer any questions. What is a little bit different is this provision right here, where it talks about if the resale certificate was issued more than 30 days, but less than 12 months, the seller or purchaser, upon proof of there being a contract purchaser of the unit, may request an updated resale certificate. And so that resale certificate shall be paid for and delivered to the person requesting it. And it talks here about the time frame in which that update must be provided. So that's the long and short of the revision to the statute and the mashup, if you will, of the seller's obligations to provide a resale certificate to the purchaser. So you can see here that paragraph 9D, having to do with property owners association disclosure, and 9E, having to do with a condo disclosure, was deleted from the listing contract. Nothing changed in lead-based paint other than the numbering of the paragraph. And you could see here that we also got rid of the obligation. It's a proactive disclosure that the seller had, one of the very few, disclosure regarding manufacturing methamphetamine. And as we said before, identifying just one of those affirmative disclosures around a laundry list of other disclosures that the seller is required to make didn't seem to make sense. So we got rid of that for the sake of efficiency. And as I mentioned in a previous video, I think I did, was we moved this license disclosure and whether the property is occupied by a tenant, we moved them down here to paragraphs number 9F and 9G. And then lastly, and fairly significantly, we moved the septic waiver disclosure to the listing contract. And the reason is that we are asking the seller at the listing stage whether or not the property has been granted a waiver under from the State Board of Health. And the reason that we did this is to hopefully do away with the septic disclosure that we have when we negotiate purchase contracts. If the seller is not operating under a waiver, then the statute does not require any further action by either the seller or the purchaser. So by the seller making this representation, if in fact they have not obtained a waiver, it does away with the need to have the waiver or the confirmation and disclosure of that form of the septic waiver included in the purchase agreement package. And of course, if the seller has been obtained a waiver, then we would have to make that disclosure to the purchaser. So that's it for paragraph number 9.